I'm Joeita Gupta, and this is The Pulse. When a language dies, so does the link to the cultural past. People lose their sense of identity and belonging without that crucial tether. For Indigenous communities, language forms more than a method of communication. Indigenous languages form an integral point of complex knowledge systems developed over thousands of years and are central to a defined worldview. Preserving language is crucial to the struggle for self-determination within Indigenous communities. Sadly, many of these Indigenous languages are under considerable threat. According to the United Nations, Indigenous people the world over speak close to 4,000 distinct languages. And it's estimated that if things don't change radically, one Indigenous language would die every 2 weeks. Today, we discuss the preservation of Indigenous languages. It's time to put your finger on the pulse. Back in December 2023, the Dakota Ojibwe Tribal Council and the University of Manitoba announced that they have an alliance with the Lucast Film Production Company, which is a subsidiary of the Walt Disney Company, to create an official Ojibwe version of Star Wars: A New Hope. What we're going to do now is have a listen to the trailer of Star Wars: A New Hope in Ojibwe. You will, of course, hear the iconic Star Wars theme music, and you'll be able to hear snippets of dialogue in Ojibwe, and you will see on the screen many familiar characters: Luke Skywalker, Leia, Han Solo, R2-D2, C-3PO, Darth Vader, and some very iconic spaceships, including the Millennium Falcon. In English on the screen, you will read the words for the first time in the Ojibwe language, Star Wars. Let's go ahead and have a look at that trailer.
Obi-Wan Kenobi.
One of the first major projects like this.
To bring the language back out into the world.
Breaking down the words, the differences between English and Ojibwe.
They go into Mock Chimnicious like a skunk.
So you have to come up with some new words like lightsaber.
The characters, they're kind of parallel to Anishinaabe people and beliefs.
My grandchildren will be able to hear this into the future and learn from it, use it.
It's just great to be a part of it.
Mayangan Linklater is the Director of Operations of the Dakota Ojibwe Tribal Council. He is also the project lead of the Ojibwe version of Star Wars: A New Hope. Hello and welcome to The Pulse. Thanks so much for speaking to me today.
Not a problem. I'm happy to be here.
How does this get started? What was the moment of inspiration or impetus where you realized you really wanted to have Star Wars: A New Hope dubbed in Ojibwe?
So it all started, I think I was driving to work in January, about in 2022, and I was driving out in the middle of the Canadian prairies when I get a phone call from Dougal Lamont. And he's been a longtime friend that I've known. And he had said, Mayangan, do you know any language translators? I'm like, Dougal, yeah. My mother is like, the most foremost expert on the Ojibwe language. I said, what's up? And so he was like, I'm in contact with Lucasfilm, and we're trying to get them to see if they can agree to dub the Star Wars Episode 4 into an Indigenous language. I said, Dougal, I'm all there. So what do you need? And so he had been the go-ahead, the go-between Lucas Film and us, because the Lucasfilm had a variety of different questions that they wanted to have answered. And so we were, I was providing him with the answers to the best of my ability at that point in time, and with respect to what he'd been doing. And finally, at one point, I just said, Dougal, I love you lots, but, you're going to muck things up. So what I'm going to do is just create a synopsis as to what, Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada has to offer. And so I wrote up a quick, a community profile based upon, what DOTC was, Dakota Ojibwe Tribal Council was all about, the location of our tribal council in relation to the rest of North America, what we had to offer in terms of Indigenous language speakers, along with, the infrastructure here with respect to Manitoba's mature film industry, as well, that we had, the Aboriginal People's Television Network here, and that, there were Indigenous people that had been involved in the film industry for, quite a while from now. And so by that, we sent it in and said, that's a good step. From there, Lucasfilm said, hey, that looks pretty good. If you guys can find the cash, and then we'll help you out. And so from there, that's when I spoke with Pat Ningwans, who happens to be my mother. She wrote out the initial game plan in terms of how the actual production would roll out from that. And then from there, we started looking for, the appropriate funding stream for that. And it was through the Indigenous Languages Program, through Canadian Heritage. And they had, a funding pool that we could tap into. Fortunately for that point in time, we had missed the application deadlines. And so we had to wait for another year to get it in. But by then, when we had the applications, the forms and all of that stuff there, it was just a matter of, cutting and pasting, making sure that, we had fit, all of the appropriate boxes, because, when you're dealing with, a government application, you have to make sure that, it has the, here's the income, or here's the input, output, timelines, budget lines, expected result.
Yeah, it's like filing your taxes, say no more.
Yeah. But we did get it in, and truth be known, we did get our funding application in on May 4th, 2020.
Oh.
Yeah, I was like,
you couldn't have done that. Did you plan it that way?
No. Because Michael Cohen over at Lucas Ranch, Lucasfilm, he had sent in the letter of confirmation saying, yeah, if these guys get the cash, they'll help us out. And then from there, I'm making it sound like a lot easier than it is, but that, in a nutshell, if you boil it down to the essence, that's essentially how it was. And I said, you know what, if we get it in on May the 4th, let's just do it. You just can't plan that any better. And then from there, it took about 6 months before we were informed that we were successful in our grant application. And then from there, we got the cash in the bank in December 2023. And it's been a flurry of activities from January all the way up until today.
Absolutely. I am curious about the translation process. First of all, why Ojibwe? There are, of course, so many Indigenous languages. What is it about Ojibwe that made it the right fit for this? And also, were there any obstacles or challenges or even opportunities inherent in the translation process?
So, like I said, my mother is like one of the most foremost Ojibwe language translators out there. She has a company called Mazinate. She is I think it's an assistant professor at the University of Manitoba. She was awarded to the Governor General Awards of Canada about a year and a half ago. Recently, she just received an honorary doctorate from the Lakehead University Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Ontario. So she has spent like a lifetime working on revitalizing and protecting the Anishinaabe language, and so it just seemed to me it was a natural fit that for me, and for her to be involved in this project, because of the fact that I've been I have grown up with the language in our community of Lexington First Nation out in Ontario. And so I have a familiarity with it. But at the same time, I also have had a long time love for the Star Wars universe as well. So when it came down to, being able to do this, we found ourselves in a situation where it's like, okay, yeah, we have the capacity to translate it. We have the project management to do it as well. We'll just have to sort of see what we do about rolling up our sleeves and getting the job done. So that was pretty much, just in terms of how we knew that we were able to do it. Because when it comes to the community of language speakers of the Anishinaabe language in Manitoba, we had a pretty good idea as to where we could potentially find them, and that we would, we felt confident that we would be able to do what we needed to do in order to get the job done. As well, I wanted to. So when it came to the actual translation, it was a very insightful process to that, because initially when we had gained access to the script, what we did was that I helped out making sure it was converted to the to Microsoft Word, so that Pat could do the word for word translation, and she was able to do that relatively within 2 or 3 weeks. And then from there, they had we brought in some Indigenous language speakers from across the Anishinaabe Nation, both in Canada, but also in the United States. So we had people from, I think, Northwestern Ontario, out in Eastern Ontario, and as a result, these language speakers were able to get together, go over the script to sort of figure out, what words were common, and then to try to identify, an appropriate word for a specific, new word that they had to create. So so that was the process, because we wanted to make it accessible to, the Ojibwe speakers across North America, at least within, within our nation have communities and language speakers. So that was the intent. But then from there, actually having to do the voice cue and to create the karaoke track for the film and the language speakers, that was another exercise for that. Just because of the fact that when that happened, you would see the inconsistencies of the word not lining up with the mouth movements of the actors on screen. So, and that just kind of harkened back to the old kung fu movies of the 1970s. So we wanted to go beyond that. And of course, I think when you look at movies these days where they are dubbed into English, there is an effort to make sure that the words line up to the mouth movements. And so that was another challenge, just because of the fact that they had to go back to the script, look at what was on the screen, conferring with the language speakers to identify what was good, what worked, what didn't work, and ultimately deciding on a word that would conform to the shape of the mouth. So that was a process unto itself. But at the end of the day, we did get that karaoke track that was a godsend for the production process. So when we had the auditions, we had auditions open up to the language speakers and people that would want to participate. They certainly had the opportunity to do so, and the actors were selected by the creative team. For myself, because I was the producer and making sure I'm looking over the budgets and the timelines, my process was just like, okay, yeah, I'll stick to my lane and make sure that the checks are signed. So that was that. And then on top of that, the production was a 9-day process. All of our language speakers came into Winnipeg, Manitoba to do their lines. And essentially they will just, start at, okay, page 3, Here's my line, age 4, age 9, age 17, and so forth. And so there was, relatively limited interaction between the voice actors because they were just going over their lines and making sure that they had met their mark as based upon the direction of the director.
Right. And of course, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, right? You have all these distinct people and then you put it together and it creates magic. I have a few minutes left. And so I really want to spend the last few minutes that we have talking about why this is such a significant project in terms of the value in preserving and promoting indigenous languages. And the reason I say this is because I'm sure you're not a stranger to this, but many indigenous languages are on the verge of extinction. And so what does a project like this do in terms of preserving, promoting, and advancing and creating space for indigenous languages and cultural exploration and expectation?
So one of the things that we want to do, stemming from this, from the Star Wars Ojibwe project, is just to provide hope, inspiration, and ultimately, promoting the revitalization of Indigenous languages. Because this is a very unique project. It involves a First Nations tribal council with 6 First Nations. It involves a post-secondary institution with the University of Manitoba. It involves a national Indigenous broadcast media company in the form of Aboriginal People's Television Network. And of course, it involves a huge, global media company as well in the form of Disney/Lucasfilm. So a part of this, in terms of just being able to, promote and inspire people to, learn their languages. Another part of this is just demonstrating that we have an opportunity, but also the ability to work with, corporations, whether they are small or large, in order to, look at, an opportunity and a unique project to get it off the ground and to do it well. I think, in terms of that is one of the outcomes that is going to be coming out of this. That I'm hoping that with the different corporations that are across the world, they see the opportunities that are there when you work with First Nations in their communities and in their regions and in their countries ultimately. But when it comes to Indigenous languages, I never grew up with it. And so I wish that, other people, that are not, that haven't learned the language such as me, they will be inspired to learn the language as well.
Well, I have to say I'm quite inspired just from talking to you. Thank you very much for speaking to me today.
Thank you, and miigwech.
That was Megan Linklater of the Dakota Ojibwe Tribal Council. Next up, in the time that we have left on the program, I'm joined by Michael Cohn, who is the Director of Distribution Operations at Lucasfilms and is also joining me now to provide his perspective on this unique project. Hello to you. Thank you very much for joining me today on The Pulse.
Hello, Joanna. Very happy to be here.
You have a long history of involvement with this particular project. You describe the Navajo version of Star Wars as a highlight of your career. In what way was it a highlight?
It was a highlight partially because it was such a surprise. It was such an unusual project. Nothing like that had been done on that level or that scale before. And there were so many challenges to overcome. For a normal title that we do in French or in Spanish or in another language, there's an established network of people and studios, and there's things there ready to go. For this particular one, there was none of that. There was not a studio that we were ready to be able to use. There were not necessarily actors ready to go. So we had to basically go and create a studio there and then hire people, not actors, people to come out and just do it. And overcoming all those challenges and the way it turned out was such a surprise. And the best part about it was at the end, people were so positive about it. It was such a wonderful thing. I went and did a few talks here and there at different locations, And afterwards, people would come up to me and they were so happy and they were so excited about it. And it was such a thrill to have people be excited about it because, sometimes not everyone's excited about everything Star Wars.
You've had this whole learning curve with the Navajo version, and then it's also been out in the world for about 10 years now. Based on all that experience, what was similar and what was dissimilar about this project?
Well, the good part about this project is we had done it with a lot of the people that we're working with this time were involved with the Navajo version. So we knew some of the things that were going to be a significant challenge. And the Navajo version was a shoestring, fly by the seat of our pants version that we did. This one was a little bit more organized, not only because we knew what we were getting ourselves into, but we had a good amount of time to get things prepared, and we had a lot of good people on this team to do it. So this one, I think, was a little bit smoother, once we got over the initial bumps of getting everything organized in the beginning.
Was there something that remained challenging for you? Was it, for example, difficult to source actors or find people to play the parts?
Yes, and that was a big part of it. That's always going to be a part of it for any type of project like this. We do have a couple people that are established actors that are in the cast, but most of the people were just people. So we did a big casting process where people would record their voice doing one of the characters they want to audition for. They'd send it in. Myself, a woman named Ellen Epcar Stern, who's our director, and another woman named Shayna Prees from our technical group Pixelogic. We'd all listen to it and go through, and we'd weed down the numbers of people. Because some people I think just did it because it was going to be fun and they get to be part of it. It's kind of like watching American Idol. Sometimes people get up there and you're like, well, they're out there because they want to have fun, but I think they understand that it's not going to get there. And then there were some people that came through that sounded good, and we did a second round of recordings with the director to give some direction to see, not only could they speak the language properly with the right tone and inflection and accent, could they read the script and be able to do it, with a little bit of acting. And Ellen did that version of it with them, so we had a second round of interviews, and that really helped us narrow down the people to people like, yes, not only can they speak it, but they can read it. And they can act to some extent while doing all those things, which is a lot of pressure for someone who's never done it before.
I'm curious about your experience with the Navajo version, having seen it out in the world for about 10 years. And as you said, it was a shoestring project. But I'm curious about whether in the aftermath of that project, you felt that it had opened up opportunities for Indigenous artists, whether they were voice actors or even, as performers in original productions. Would you say that the Navajo version had ripple effects beyond simply dubbing Star Wars?
For sure. I don't know about actors from our version necessarily, but I know there were a lot of groups that came out afterwards that wanted to do it. The person I work with on Navajo, the lead person was named Manny Wheeler, and he was very passionate and still is very passionate about trying to get other versions created. So he actually worked with Disney and with some other studios to do a bunch of other versions. So ours was the first big version to do Star Wars with Navajo, but then there was quite a few others that have come along. And it turns out that it's not even just Native American versions. There's other countries for some of our Disney titles that when the themes are based on a local culture, we end up dubbing it in those languages as well. So yes, it has definitely opened up a lot of opportunities.
What is it about Star Wars that made it the right project for not just a dub, but for something that carries a lot of significance beyond the dubbing itself? Is there something about, why Star Wars? Why not The Sound of Music, for example?
I think there's probably two answers. I think part of it is the hope is to connect the older generation with the younger generation. So hopefully the younger generation is excited about seeing Star Wars, maybe more than The Sound of Music. I don't know. But a way to be able to get a sci-fi action movie and one of the biggest movies of all time in this genre, to be able to have kids be excited to go see it in this language that the older generations are, trying to get the kids to be able to be excited about. I think that was important to do it that way. I think that helped quite a bit. Probably the more important thing is, and when the Navajo came to us, and even when the Ojibwe and Mohegan came to us, the themes in Star Wars seem to resonate with some of their culture. The Force and things like that seem to be something that could translate very well in their culture and something they understood and they thought would be a good way to like I said, bridge the younger and older generations.
Do you mind if we spend a bit more time talking about this? Because I am curious about some of the parallels between indigenous culture and some of the themes explored in Star Wars. You mentioned the Force, the push and pull between good and evil, the fight back against the Empire. I wonder if you observed some decolonial themes as well. What are some of the parallels that you might have observed given your lengthy involvement with this particular project?
Sure, and the idea about colonization and the empire, that it's definitely another theme that has come up many times in discussing with a lot of people involved in it. There's so many movies that have that idea of good versus evil, whatever. But the empire just running over all these galaxies and on all these planets is certainly a theme that is understood in this group for sure.
I'm wondering if you have big dreams about the future, because certainly Star Wars is a massive franchise. There's it's all told 9 episodes and so many spin-offs. The opportunities are endless. As you look to the future, are you hoping to see more of the Star Wars films dubbed, not just in the Navajo language, but also in Anishinaabe, in some of the other indigenous languages that we're talking about? I dare say the sky is the limit, but if you had to envision how this project might grow in the next 5 to 10 years, what's your vision for the future?
I would love to do it. I've had such a good time on this project and the previous one. I would love to do as many as we can. I'm sure you can appreciate there's only so many resources that can be attached to this. And this one has taken us about 2 years to get from start to finish here. So it takes a lot of time and effort to do it. So I would love to do 5 of them a year if I could, but I don't think I could survive that. But yes, I definitely hope there could be more. I know the Navajo Nation has wanted to do another one with us. And like I said, they've done others with Disney. I've spoken with all the people involved in this project, and they're very interested in trying to have more of their population involved so they can do some of these on their own, not only with their content, but with other content, which is certainly something I would happily support.
Michael, it's been such a pleasure speaking today. Congratulations. It's a wonderful project, and I'm so delighted you could speak to us about it today.
My pleasure.
There go two voices who are instrumental in the creation of the Ojibwe version of Star Wars: A New Hope. The Ojibwe version of Star Wars: A New Hope made its debut on August 8, 2024. So that was the day before yesterday at Centennial Concert Hall in Winnipeg. And starting today, that's August 10th, it will also debut in limited release in Winnipeg and other select markets. Eventually down the road, you will be able to catch the Ojibwe version of Star Wars on APTN and also on Disney, but more details on that down the road. If you have any feedback for us, you are welcome to write us an email. Write to feedback@ami.ca. You can find us on X at AMI Audio. Use the hashtag PulseAMI. If you would like to send a tweet and let us know about the program, you can find us on Facebook at Accessible Media Inc. And of course, feel free to give us a call at 1-866-509-4545. That's 1-866-509-4545. Don't forget to leave permission to play the audio on the program. That's all the time we have for today. I'd like to extend a heartfelt thank you to Enrica Delanerold, senior producer for AMI Audio, who was instrumental in arranging this interview for us. Mark Aflalo is a technical producer. Ryan Delahanty is the coordinator for AMI Audio Podcasts. Andy Frank is the manager for AMI Audio. And I've been your host, Joeita Gupta. Thanks so much for listening.